Hello and welcome to this video. I will not talk about mapping in this one, but OpenStreetMap was involved in this project, so there is a connection. I had given this talk some years ago in Kells in County Kilkenny, and it's a very small venue, so there weren't an awful lot of people at it. And I thought that maybe it would be of interest to a wider audience to hear the German perspective of the First World War. So I'm recording this now, and I hope you find it interesting. I got involved with the project in 2014 because my great uncle lives in that village called Limlingerode, and he is a retired pastor, and he did a lot of work in the community, rebuilding the community in Limlingerode, which had kind of suffered in the years when Germany was divided. I'll get to that later. But they found or rediscovered these 5 copybooks in 2011 of 793 pages handwritten in this old German handwriting that very few people can read anymore. But I had learned it in arts class in school, so they asked me to transcribe these 793 pages so they could make a publication about it, which they succeeded a couple of years later. And they were written by the pastor between 1914 and 1919. His name was August Rönnefahrt, and he was the last pastor in that village, actually. When he moved away in 1912, nobody moved back into the glebe house, I suppose you could call it, or the priest's house, only he was Lutheran. So it fell into disrepair, but these chronicles were still in the attic, but they were discovered and rescued and then given to my great uncle, who's also a scholar. So he asked me to transcribe them, and I did that in the village, and it was exactly 100 years after the war broke out. So as I was typing away on my laptop, I could hear the harvesters going behind the house, doing what harvesters do in August, while I was typing up how all the horses from the village were drafted in 1914. So the people had great difficulties harvesting in 1914 because there were no combine harvesters. They had horses, but then they didn't because the horses were drafted first, even before the people. So it was very real. It wasn't just an abstract research project. It was very real, and the descendants of the people are still living in the village and so on. So Limlingerode is, as I said, is this small village in the province of Thuringia, or in the Bundesland, federal state of Thuringia, right bang in the middle of Germany. And it has now, according to Wikipedia, 279 people living there. And it has quite an active Lutheran church community, which is partly due to my great uncle. And they moved there in 1990, my great uncle, and restored this farmhouse with the help of the family. And I spent a lot of weekends there as a child. And when they moved there, and when we went to visit them, the villagers were very suspicious towards any strangers, and they were not welcoming at all. The reason is that it was very, very close to the border with West Germany. When people think of East and West Germany, they only ever think of the wall in Berlin, but of course the whole country was divided, and it wasn't just, it wasn't just a wall. There was a death strip, so if you got too close, you were shot. So they were very close to that border, and after the border was established, nobody was allowed to move into the village, and whenever there were visitors, the villagers had to report that to the police, and if one villager was seen by a neighbour not to report the visitor, they in turn had to report their neighbour for not reporting the visitor. So as a result, the people in the village, as soon as they saw anyone, they just closed their doors and the windows, so they couldn't, if anyone asked, they could say, we didn't see them. And this continued after the wall came down, which wasn't just the wall, it was the whole border with fencing and dogs and automatic shooting and stuff like that. So quite horrible. And if you went through the village, there's a forest behind the village, and the border is in that forest, so that's why it was very important for visitors to be reported, so they couldn't just escape through the forest into West Germany. But through community projects like restoring the church organ, and these war chronicles, the community was strengthened, and that started with my great uncle and his family, and they are very Lutheran, but they included everyone, obviously. So in 1914, the population of the village was 430, because everybody had maids and manservants and so on, which nowadays they don't. So the population has gone down quite a bit. But the number of houses has stayed the same and was 76. And we know that 103 men from the village had been drafted, so that's a quarter of all the people in the village, which is, it's quite a lot. And 80 of them took part in battles. And as a result, they were missing from farm work, but not just as a workforce, but there were also fathers, brothers, sons that were away, and everybody thought it's going to be over by Christmas, and of course it wasn't. And also it had an effect on the youth of the village, the way they behaved, which is mentioned in the War Chronicles. So 17 of the 103 that were drafted died fighting, some in the field hospitals as a result of injuries they got fighting. 10 of them were prisoners of war, one of them since September 1914. And of course that'll do something to your mental health as well. 42 were married and or fathers. 61 were not married, but 7 of those got married before the truce. Some of the men were also released from their war service because they had a weak constitution. There's a history of rheumatism in the village, and they also tend to be quite small, the people from that village. There are 3 street names in the village, which translates to Long Row, Middle Row, and Back Lane, and the houses are numbered from 1 to 76, but the numbering just continues on. You don't have 1 to 10 Long Row and then 1 to 10 Middle Row. It just continues on no matter what the name of the street is. But the numbering still survives until today, the same numbering that was there now over 100 years ago, so we could identify the houses that Rönnefahrt was mentioning in the Chronicles, and we could identify the families obviously by the names. Rönnefahrt himself was born in 1859, and he studied theology in Halle, and then died in 1944 in Halberstadt, which is all not very far from Limlingerode. He had been a Lutheran pastor in Limlingerode since 1906 with his wife, and he had 2 children, a boy and a girl. The son also went on to become a pastor and wrote War Chronicles during the Second World War. August Rönnefahrt, the father, he started writing the Chronicles on August 18th, 1914, and the last entry is in May 1919. And the last entry is to catch up with the status of missing soldiers, etc., and how the village has recovered from war, if it has. He retired in 1912 and left Limlingerode for health reasons, I think. So, as I said, the rectorate closed down and began to deteriorate because it was an abandoned building. In the War Chronicles, he describes the economic and personal influences of the war on the village, and also tracks the monetary and other donations meticulously, as you would expect from a German. He collected data on every man who joined the war with a little introduction about their family, their profession, etc. A lot of them were builders and farmers, of course, and he also copied letters that the soldiers had sent to him or their family, and then he went to the family and got the letters and copied them. He also noted his sermons, the Bible quotes, and the hymns sung during the services. So it's a very interesting source for historians, could be anyway, to see what kinds of hymns they sung during the services and how hymn lyrics were reinterpreted to fit the war, and weren't intended as that by Martin Luther or whoever wrote those hymns. He was very eager and nationalistic in the beginning, but then in 1917 and 18, the number of entries decreases, which is probably also due to his illness, and he had to stay in hospital for a couple of weeks, and maybe also his euphoria for the war kind of ceased due to the nature and what was going on. I'll read a translation of the introduction that he wrote into the first copybook. So the first copybook he titled on the front War Chronicle, and the other 4 volumes, so to speak, he called Participants of the War from Limlingerode. So I'll read this quote that he wrote as the introduction. If I have started a diary for the duration of the war of 1914, it can of course not be its nature to sketch the general history of the war, its origins and progression, but I will have to limit myself to describing on these pages to what extent and in what way the village of Limlingerode participated with war donations, sacrifices, and sufferings, and what happened to the village and especially the families hit most, and to support them with comfort and help. May God the Lord be with us all in this misery. Limlingerode, 18th of August, 1914. End quote. So he describes how the war was declared and continues to explain how it affected the village. The mobilization order arrived Saturday the 1st of August between 7 and 8 p.m. And a reverend from the neighboring village of Stöckei had been visiting, and he had walked him back the way to Stöckei with him. And upon his return, he met crying women and knew what had happened. Like, it didn't come out of the blue. They knew there was going to be a war. At the church service the next day, he used Romans 12, verses 11 and 12. Quote, "Be not slothful in business, fervent in spirit, serving the Lord, rejoicing in hope, patient in tribulation, continue in instant in prayer." End quote. The hymns sung were "Auf Gott und nicht auf meinen Rat," which translates to "Rule thou my portion, Lord, my skill I could not trust to guide it." So some of these hymns are translated into English, but you would probably have to be Protestant to know them. The other one was "Vater, kröne du mit Segen," Father, crown with your blessing. It is about blessing the ruler to rule wisely. And verse 6 is about giving bravery in danger, and that will all die gladly. So you can see he was still very supportive. There was a prayer said for the men drafted already, with the congregation praying on their knees, which is not usual for Lutherans nowadays. And the organ was playing "Bete nur betrübtes Herz," which translates to "Pray sad heart." And the organ, by the way, was not in a very good state already back then, which we found out while doing all this research, but it's working now because they had it restored. The congregation got up then and heard Psalm 46, "God is our refuge and strength," and sang "Ein feste Burg ist unser Gott," which is also sung in Protestant churches here, "A mighty fortress is our God," which is a Lutheran hymn. And then Rönnefahrt read the speech Kaiser Wilhelm had given on the 31st of July to his so-called children in Berlin. And then at the end of the church service, again, it's not a thing done anymore, they sang the German anthem "Deutschland, Deutschland über alles." I mean, we don't have that hymn anymore anyway, but in my experience, there are also no anthems sung in the Protestant church service. And of course, the church was packed and the mood was very patriotic. The next day, 3 horse transports came through the village, staying for the night, and high-ranking men were being hosted by the Reverend. The first transport had 82 horses, the second 118, and the third 33. And on Tuesday, the 4th of August, 14 horses from Limlingerode were provided to the fatherland, as Rönnefahrt puts it, and the farmers were compensated higher than the purchase price had been, but there were no horses for sale. So they had the money, but they couldn't buy any horses because they were all gone for the war. In the following days, roadblocks had been established to catch spies, etc., which led to some confusion because the newly appointed guards, abused their newly gained power by choosing not to recognize certain people. Sometimes when I was reading these chronicles, like, I was laughing because it was so ridiculous, some of the situations like this one. But I also cried a lot while I was writing these or transcribing. There were actual spies also reported. I'll read another quote. "A car went through Mackenrode. The district nurse Ida Hoffmann saw it with her own eyes, in which a lady was seated, looking around cheekily, and her leg outstretched conspicuously. It was apparently a dressed-up Russian spy who was hiding 2 of his accomplices under his legs. The people in Mackenrode telegraphed immediately to Nordhausen. These people were arrested in Nordhausen. What further happened to them I could not ascertain. Furthermore, we heard from Nordhausen that a gang of Russians dressed up as gypsies and carrying bombs were arrested and interned. Some arrested spies and traitors have also been shot in Nordhausen. However, I could not ascertain their number definitely." So Nordhausen is the main town in that administrative area, which is where I was born. It has now about 45,000 people, so it's a small German town. And Mackenrode is the next village over from Limlingerode towards Nordhausen. The war continued to affect the village not just by the men leaving, but by new laws that were brought in. One example was the ban of baked goods like cakes, which affected the local tradition during confirmation celebrations of going from house to house on Palm Sunday, having cake in every house. So, the whole bake tray thing. The first year, the Reverend was lenient because he saw that people needed a joyful day as a break from all the sorrow that the war brought. But he asked the congregation not to serve cakes and alcohol in every house. The next year, he asked the villagers to refrain from serving cakes at all, so they would not have to break the law, and also pointing out that people in towns were already suffering from food shortages. The children were very sad, and the villagers pointed out that they needed some joy in their life, so the Reverend took back his ban. There were several efforts to keep young people indoors and occupied by having knitting groups for the girls and a carving course for the boys, because, as I said before, the fathers were gone, and it was kind of a lack of authority. It was partly in vain because the young people kept gallivanting the Chausseestrasse between Mackenrode and Stöckei with loud singing and shouting, and going to the pubs and only returning home at midnight or 1 a.m. Older villagers were offended in their mourning for loved ones, and also just simply the lack of sleep that was caused by this havoc. Rönnefahrt points out that the leaders of these excesses are not local boys and girls, but helping hands from neighboring villages, with a sudden increase in freedom away from their parents and a sudden financial freedom. Some of these side effects he mentions are money being stolen from parents, war weddings being held, for example, a wedding in May, and the child was born in June. And also a 40-year-old maid got pregnant by a 17-year-old, whose father had just died in Russia shortly before, and there were also fights on the streets. I think she lost the baby, by the way. The first fallen soldier was Friedrich Manstedt. He was a carpenter and farmer, and he was drafted on August the 4th, 1914, and transported to the Western Front. Rönnefahrt collected 21 field postcards and a letter from August 4th to November 9th. Many of the men from Limlingerode and the surrounding area were members of the 11th Army Corps, so some of them met by chance and heard news from home. The fifth postcard from Belgium, from Arbofontein, dated the 4th of August, which is not very likely because he just left at the 4th of August, but it arrived in Limlingerode on August 21st. Dear parents and sister, we have been on enemy's territory for a couple of days now, and we have to be terribly careful, always with loaded rifles and always in company of other men. The houses here are vacant and abandoned. Prisoners and rifles are always brought to Germany. We are stationed not far from the fortress of Namur. Then we're off to Paris. Otherwise, all well. What I also hope for you. Best wishes from your son, Friedrich Manstedt. End quote. I mentioned earlier that I used OpenStreetMap for this project, so I made a map of where all the postcards were sent from and where all the soldiers were stationed and so on. And it was very, very useful to have OpenStreetMap because these men were farmers' sons. They left school after, 8th grade, so they had no French and no Russian, and they just spelled the place names phonetically, and it was very difficult to find out what they meant, but OpenStreetMap helped an awful lot finding these places. The next postcard was from August 24th and arrived a week later. Dear parents and sister, want to let you know that we have conquered the fortress of Namur and have fought a number of battles, otherwise still safe and sound. I could tell you much more in person. Slept here last night. The Frenchmen dropped their weapons and saddles and ran as fast as they can. Took 5,000 French prisoners and loads of food. Set many forts on fire. Local people have all fled. Please write soon. Haven't heard from home in a while. Our regiment was the first to move in. End quote. Friedrich Manstedt was transported to the Eastern Front after this and wrote postcards from the train journey which passed through Nordhausen. So Nordhausen was a huge train station. It had, 12 platforms or something. There are now, I think, 3 left, or maybe 4. But a lot of the trains went through Nordhausen on their way from the Western Front to the Eastern Front. And oftentimes the men didn't have time to tell their wives because they couldn't, no mobile phones. And the mail was, of course, also censored. On August 31st, he writes, Our German people cannot thank God enough for sparing it, because in France and Belgium, where we have been, Everything is destroyed and burned. Animals and people lying on the road in piles, cannot even be passed in some places. All the beautiful towns, everything robbed and burned. But onwards for God, for king and country. Since we're finished here in the west, we'll go east now, to do our duty, but I think it won't be too bad. Dear parents, we had a 3-day battle here in Belgium, where the bullets whizzed past our ears, but without damaging us too much. Of my 71st Regiment, there were about 30 dead and 30 injured, and of my company 5 injured. One of them, the teacher Bildshausen to Pützlingen from Rönnefahrt. I served with him. He got shot in the stomach. I'll tell you the other incidents when I see you, etc." End quote. He continues writing about being on the train and about battles and about getting parcels from home, etc. The last word from him was November 9th, and on December 2nd a rumour arrived in the village that he had died on November 18th. A soldier from Mackenrode had written to his parents. Rönnefahrt writes, "Today, December 5th, I went to his parents. They already knew about the rumour and feared the worst, but still have some hope that he is only heavily injured, because they have not gotten the official news and because no letters and parcels were returned. I have tried to comfort them and read the hymn 502 to them. My God, I know well that I will die. They were very composed and behaved like decent Christians in their heartfelt fear. The next morning, though, the carpenter Manstedt, which is the father, went to the sheriff to sign up for war duty." End quote. Jesus, is very difficult to read. I'm already fighting the tears. A copy of his application follows, and Rönnefahrt comments, "Isn't that deeply harrowing? After reading it, I did not intervene, because I'm telling myself that this is a spontaneous reaction rooted in the overwhelming hurting feelings of a father's heart. He will not leave it thus. He can't and won't leave wife and child and the farm. He will change his mind as soon as he has calmed down. I am hearing that Manstedt withdrew after his wife, child and friends had begged him to." End quote. On January 18th, 1915, a letter arrived from Erfurt to Master Carpenter Manstedt, which Rönnefahrt copied into the Chronicles. "The battalion has the sad duty to inform you that your son, Reservist Friedrich Manstedt, fell on the 19th of November 1914 near Włodzimiersk in faithful serving his country." End quote. Sorry, I'm probably going to butcher a lot of the Polish and Russian names. So for 2 months, the family had been waiting for the official news and not wanting to treat him as dead. Even the local newspaper had published a list of war victims, naming him just before New Year's Eve with his name on it, but mistakes had been made before, so the parents did not trust the newspaper completely. On January 24th, a memorial service was held. Rönnefahrt copies his sermon into the War Chronicles following John 16:22. "So with you, now is your time of grief, but I will see you again, and you will rejoice, and no one will take away your joy." He said to the congregation, "Yes, so with you too, father, mother, sisters, and bride, you too, like so many others, hundreds, thousands are grieving. And all of us who knew him so well, respected and loved him for his modesty, for his trustful, open soul, we feel with you in your sorrow. We all have our time of grief, because it is the first war victim." End quote. He goes on very patriotic about the great cause Friedrich died for, the fatherland, the home soil that fathers and their fathers have given their blood for, but also all the women and children, the old, weak, and the sick that those men went out to defend. "We will meet again, not on home soil in the village, but up above in the Heavenly Father's home." The second soldier was Otto Schönstedt. He was a woodworker born in November 1890 and served in the cycling unit. He was one of the most diligent writers, with letters to the family, his fiancée in Schiedungen, and the Reverend. There is the first field postcard from August 13th with no location given. Quote, "Yesterday we had a heavy village battle with those damn red trousers," i.e. the French. "Oh, you have no idea what such a battlefield looks like, but we showed them what the old Prussians are made of. We got them out of their basements. We had 600 prisoners of war, but the bullets whizzed past our ears. Greetings, Otto." End quote. And then there was another letter in October without a location. Quote, "Dear relatives, you complain about me writing so little, but I write a letter or a postcard every week. It is possible that mail is not being delivered quickly, with our positions changing so often. because we are now in northern France, about 80 kilometers from Paris. We've been here in the same spot for 8 days now. We had big losses recently. Dear brother, if you have heard from the Battle of Lauterfingen, which is Rönnefahrt, to Luneville, it was a hot struggle, but the Frenchies learned how to run fast. They ran like a herd of sheep without a leader, and our artillery and machine guns did their job right. The Frenchies lay there like they had been mown down, 10 to 12 in a heap. I had to guard 25 injured soldiers, among them a French corporal who spoke very good German. I asked him what he thought about our machine guns. He explained to me that they were pure infernal machines, very much feared by them. Also, they know the command Seitengewehr auf, which is sidearm up or something. And when their lads hear that, they couldn't be stopped and would just bolt. I gave him bread and water to drink. Then he said he'd never have thought that us Germans could be so kind, and shook my hand with tears in his eyes and said, Guter Kamerad, which is like good mate or something. It isn't up to us, neither is it to you. We have to fight for our country just the same as you do. If only the French soldiers were as good as the Germans. Also, he said, they hadn't eaten in 4 days. Who wouldn't have been touched by it to hear that from the enemy? And when my relief came, he shook my hand again and wished me all the best. There you see, when the Holy Script says, love our enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you. Now fare thee well, hoping to see you again, your Otto, dying far away for the country. End quote. He sent money home and repeatedly asked for warm clothing and food. On November 2nd, 1914, he writes, Dear relatives, with great joy I take up the pen to tell you, dear loved ones, that I received your big parcel today. You can imagine my joy, because I had not seen, let alone eaten, any sausages or bacon in 8 weeks, only stale bread, and not even that all the time. Everything arrived in a good state, thank you so much, and may our Lord give that I can see you, my loved ones, again, healthy and happy. Last night at 2, we attacked a village called Lyon. Healthy and freshly we started off, but suddenly we got fired at and had to retreat to the trenches. All the Frenchmen shot everything they had to shoot until the early hours, and when we gathered up, one could have cried the most bitter of tears, because of the 215 men, there were only 90 left. Oh, my dear mates, there they are, resting in the cool earth. Isn't that heartbreaking? We had just met, now they are lying there dead or injured. Oh, I wish we had peace already, and the war was over. Because who knows how close I am to my end. Today safe and sound, and tomorrow a corpse. End quote. He goes on to thank for other parcels he received and asked about other soldiers. On the 1st of February, he was transferred to Russia, and his relatives did not hear from him until the second half of March. Quote, Dear brother, mother, sister-in-law, Otchen and Willi, I received your dear parcels, which I thank you very much for. Yes, my loved ones, what did you think when you didn't hear from me for so long? We were only given our mail from January and February now. You can imagine how I felt when I heard nothing from home. Oh, my loved ones, how much would I have loved to let you know that we were passing Nordhausen, but we were not allowed. When the troops are transferred, everything is very secret, so nobody knows which troops they are. You won't believe what it felt like to be so close to home, when you don't know if you're ever going to come back. Because again, I have lost a dear friend from Großbodungen called Heinrich Peter, who will never see the homeland again. End quote. He goes on to explain how horrible Russia is in comparison to France because of the climate and the things they see from previous battles. Quote, And another thing, I almost forgot, the lice. Oh, you can't escape them, there is no help, and the more new clothes you put on, the worse it gets. I have scratched open my whole body. I cannot sleep a minute with these lads. Everyone has them, from the most common soldier to the highest ranking officer. When we have a day off or else a few minutes off, you see the same maneuver everywhere. Everyone takes their shirt off, and whoever catches most of them little Russians wins. Please send something for them, the strongest stuff you can get. There is a sample of the little Russian, so Achtung. He has put a few pressed lice in with the letter on the last pages of it. End quote. His last postcard is dated April the 2nd, 1915. Quote, Dear all, got your letter, which I enjoyed, saying the warmest and best thanks for it. I'm well so far, which I hope for you as well. Didn't get any of those parcels yet. Happy Easter to you, all your Otto." End quote. Otto died on April 5th, 1915. The postman gave the letter to the Reverend, which had been sent to Otto's brother with the remark, "Died in the field of honor, April 5th. The postman asked the Reverend to give this letter to the family and tell them as gently as possible. The Reverend went to the house and only met the old widow, the mother of the deceased, and the 2 sick children of her older son. She was already sad because that morning her oldest son had been drafted, so the Reverend decided not to tell them that day and to return the next day. The daughter-in-law had by then learned the news but not told the mother, so the Reverend told her then as gently as he could and says in the Chronicles that his heart never hurt as much as that time and that he never felt so helpless in trying to comfort someone. And then he writes to the regiments to find out more about how the death occurred. Some words about the charity in the village and the donations. In Book 5, Rönnefahrt takes stock of all the material support that the village gave to the soldiers and their families. He says that there's no real poverty in the village to start with. The farmers own horses and cattle, and even former weavers and builders have turned to farming and keep goats and pigs. There are no poor people depending on charity. The almshouse in the village has been unoccupied for years, and people gave money generously. He compares it with other villages around, and the people from Limlingerode always gave most. And it's still like that to this day. They're very generous people. He admits that the generosity has decreased with the war going on for 3.5 years, and so some parishioners don't donate at all anymore, but he doesn't give the names. Sometimes soldiers would write home not to send anything because they didn't receive it anyway. People donated also for submarines to be built, for soldiers' homes, etc. The material collected included metal, rubber, women's hair, tin, old maps, acorns, beech nuts, elderberries, nettles, may beetles, sunflower seeds to make oil, tea substitutes like bramble leaves, fruit pips, berries and mushrooms, hawthorn fruit as coffee substitute, newspaper for recycling, bottles, bones, etc. The people of the village were hit hardest when their copper cauldrons had to be handed in. So when the first decree came out to hand them in, only people with more than one copper cauldron did so. And they were, of course, that was before electricity. People used them for laundry, for to cook mush, to slaughter pigs, and so on. People were very disappointed because some of the cauldrons that they had donated were stored in the pub for up to 2 years before they were being delivered to the next authority. And people even wrote poems about their copper cauldron. That's how important they were for them. Another thing that had to be handed in was the church bell. There was a government decree from March the 1st, 1917 to confiscate all bronze church bells to be turned over and melted down. The 3 church bells in the church in Limlingerode were assessed, and only the biggest, dated 1834, was considered not to be of any artistic value. The congregation was very fond of its biggest bell, so the Reverend and the Sheriff tried to convince the authorized expert and to save it from being decommissioned as a church bell. The expert in turn tried to convince them that the bell would die a hero's death because he knew from reliable sources that they were being melted down to be made into torpedoes for the submarines. The Reverend actually took advantage of the bell expert being there and had the middle-sized bell assessed, which turned out to have been made before 1200, and actually had the name Ezekiel written on it in mirrored writing. I think it is now in a museum. In July, a letter from the superintendent arrived, which is the church superintendent, arrived to remind them to turn in the bell, but the people in the village would have none of that. They delayed to bring it down from the bell tower in the hope that the war would be over soon, and they were also angry about the war ministry because their copper cauldrons had been confiscated already, which was vital, as I said, for laundry and slaughtering animals. The Reverend notes the emotional connection of the farmers to their bell when they are usually much more materialistic. At the end of July, the bell was taken down with some effort, but ended up resting in the open air for 2.5 months, with the church goers passing it every Sunday solemnly. In mid-October, it was brought to the nearest railway station, and they held a farewell service for their bell. I hope that gave you a little bit of an insight into how the First World War affected one little village in Germany. I could have read more, but it's just too emotional. I can't really go on anymore. I'm sorry about that. If I find that map that I made back then, I'll link it down in the video description, but it will probably be in German, but it'll give you a bit of an idea of where all these things happened. Thank you for listening and watching, and I shall see you in another video, hopefully, that will be more about mapping and hopefully a bit more cheerful. Slán go fóill.